This video is the first in a series where my intention is to take you with me on some of my investigation into these structures. So we're just going to look at a handful of old world beauties, if you will. Beginning with this one, the Alwyn Court. Let's take a closer look at this one. Now, this one is 13 stories, built between 1907 and 1909, so right in that 2-year time span. 13 stories, includes a basement with a wine cellar. And very, very ornate, this one. Jaw-droppingly ornate, I would say. No square inch left plain for us to wonder what they could have put there. So originally built, we're told, to contain 2 apartments per floor. Here you can see a floor plan with the inner courtyard as well. By the 30s, so 20 years later, they decided to subdivide a lot of these and increase the amount of living spaces per floor. And I'll just take you through some of these visuals. Interesting story attached to this. Apparently not long after it opens, there's a fire. You can see here, stroke of bad luck, just months after it opens. Only 5 apartments are already occupied. There's a fire damage to the upper floors of the building. They repaired it quickly and of course filled it up quickly, but then dropped out of fashion 20 years later. So, very thin backstory, very overly ornate structure, as you can see here. I of course have questions as to the timeline of construction, the purpose for all of this, and what its original use may have been. But certainly worth a look. The Alwyn Court. The architects on this one are hard and short. So let's take a quick look at the work of these gentlemen. You can see a very similar looking building here. And the narrative tells us that they were known for designing intricate apartment building facades for nearly a decade, that first decade of the 20th century, and then they just sort of disappear. So fitting all the hallmarks to me of a manufactured story, and I wouldn't really put any stock in what we're being told about the history of the work these gentlemen did. The Alwyn Court. And very strange to me, if you're trying to fit this into the narrative, why you would put anything like this on the side of a building just for the purpose of aesthetics. We've seen this shape before in many of these old world structures, and something, some sort of harnessing device would be my guess as to what's going on here. And as I often suspect with these types of structures, you can see the difference here between the cornice line, the very plain looking cornice line at the top here, and the rest of the structure, suggesting to me the likelihood that there was much more going on up here once upon a time, whether it was a cone and a tower on the corner, mansard style roof, or what have you. This is the attempt of the inheritors to lessen the effect of these structures over time, in my opinion. Our next piece of architecture takes us to St. Paul, Minnesota. You can see it labeled here as the City Hall and Courthouse in St. Paul. This is a wonderful old photograph from the Detroit Photographic Company. The highest quality ones I'm able to find from this era. And this is a bit of an enigma and a difficult search. You'd think it would be simpler to find evidence on this. So if I try to do an initial search on the City Hall and Ramsey County Courthouse, it takes me to this structure here. It says completed in 1932. With the one we were just looking at, it appears to have been demolished right before this one goes up. And a little further digging, and we discover that this one is the 3rd courthouse, and the one that I'm featuring would be considered the 2nd courthouse, a very short-lived duration. You can see the first one, they'll tell us, was from 1851 to 1889. And this one, the one that we're featuring, stands from 89 to 32. We're told it began to rise. Interesting, the wording they always use. Began to rise in 1885. So we're going to go with about a 4-year timeline on this Castle Courthouse in St. Paul, Minnesota. Massive boom in population at the time. And then as we get to the end of its lifespan, the explanation will be that the existing courthouse was just too small to service the needs of the county, and so they built this monolith-looking, poor excuse for an Art Deco building. And as we look at some of the wording here, within 5 years a grand jury found the courthouse antiquated and inconvenient. No government building could have adapted well to such growth. Excuses for its demolition, of course. You also see an interesting piece of the narrative here where apparently they catch a break in the construction of this third courthouse and the justification for the demolition of the second when the stock market crashes and the cost of materials and labor becomes dirt cheap. So a way to explain the reasoning for building this third one. And here's another look at old St. Paul, Minnesota with its streetcars, and you can see the inheritors setting up a shack here. I don't know if they're trying to tell us that this is a part of the construction process. I don't think so. I think this is later on in the game. Strange that you would have this just parked out front, looking very ramshackle, if you will, compared to the structure behind it. And at first it was a difficult search because this building kept popping up originally. This is the old federal courthouse and post office that still stands in St. Paul, looking very similar to the courthouse that I'm featuring here. And I also noticed that some of my search took me over to the Minneapolis City Hall, which still stands, which you're looking at here. Massive old world structure, very, very similar features architecturally. Very imposing structure. And it would be definitely have been a difficult demolition. So it's interesting that this one still stands. But St. Paul, just next door, would have had something very similar. Designated once as a city hall and a courthouse, but no longer stands because they took it down. And this one does feature in one of my books on demolished old world buildings in North America. Can't remember which one. I definitely recommend you check those out if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So many of these structures have been removed from our existence and only now remain with paper-thin backstories and visuals such as this. Moving on to Cape Girardeau in Missouri. And just to help a little bit with the geography, you can see it here on the Mississippi River, this location. And this one looks to me like a classic inheritor's photograph. If we zoom in on what's going on here, you can see the what we'll be told are the construction gentlemen, looking like we're getting more of a renovation going on here. This guy standing on the windowsill, these guys up here, and then we have a plank across the front there. But the building, you can see the weathering going on the sides here. The timeline on this one, apparently they're just desperate to get another normal school going here. And if you don't know what a normal school is, I did a video on normal schools quite a while ago. It's basically a way or a place to teach the teachers. I think it was a part of amalgamating the curriculum, a way to normalize what was to be taught through the inheritor's narrative. But you can see we're in the 1870s here in Cape Girardeau. And the building plans are accepted in 1874 in January. A bid is accepted in March of 1874. One of the bricklayers is killed by lightning, we're told, in that summer. And the building is completed the following April 1875, a red brick Gothic structure. And this photograph again giving us the old and the new. You can see the temporary fence line along the front. You can see how far back this structure goes as well. I've got all sorts of peaks and decorations. Very ornate detailing here, what I would consider to be a part of the old world Antiquitech system. And if we jump ahead in the timeline to the first decade of the 20th century, we see here that they construct this academic hall, looking much like a courthouse, to replace the normal school that we're featuring here. It's lucky that they built this at this time period, as you'll see when we move through the narrative here. And I take that back, I would say unlucky, and this was built out of necessity as the featured normal school from the 1870s succumbs to fire in 1902. And we get a shot of the destruction of that building during that time period. What we're looking at here is just a brick shell of what once was, which is so often the case with these old structures. They seem to all have burned down. These brick structures seem to have burned down in those first couple decades of the 20th century, when I think the overhauling the narrative was in overdrive. They had to get rid of the evidence. And I do have an extensive file on normal schools, and normal schools across the continent, looking much like the asylums, the orphanages, and all of the rest, all a part of the same process, I would suggest. And here we can see this isolated, amazing-looking Gothic structure, and a remnant of the old world. And we'll stay on the topic of normal schools, and we'll move over to Millersville, Pennsylvania. This is the old science building at the Millersville normal school. A lot of these normal schools campuses are now university campuses, and I suppose you could say that they always were, because the intention here was to teach the educators. Does it make sense? When we zoom in a little closer, there's Millersville, not far from Lancaster, PA. And this science building being only one structure of the normal school campus. The normal school was founded in 1855, we're being told, very early on in the narrative, which fits the Pennsylvania area. And I'm having a lot of trouble finding a timeline on this structure, whether or not it was built at that starting point in the 1850s, or it was perhaps built in the 1890s, and demolition date also looks hazy. I'm seeing somewhere in the 1920s, potentially to the 1950s. Very, very hazy. If you're sensing a theme here, and you know anything about my channel and my work, yes, I have been compiling another list of buildings that were demolished here on the continent for a third installment coming later this year of demolished buildings in North America. And I have been said, well, why don't we focus on the ones that still stand? And yeah, that's something I could work on as well, but part of what I'm doing has to do with the preservation of what no longer stands, having a compilation of these structures in one place to preserve their memory. And in keeping with that, I have another structure certainly worthy of investigation, the St. Joseph's Seminary in Troy, New York. Very imposing structure on the top of a hillside in Troy. You can see here with its magnificent 4 spires in the center, and even having 2 coming off the sides. And this is the type of building in the modern day, if it were to still stand, where they would just chop a lot of these upper reaches off and flatten the top. And there are many, many structures we see with these multi-storied arch windows that have been flattened, and they don't look as impressive. They don't really catch our eye. And I think many, many more structures from the old world looked a lot more like something we're seeing here. And I just want to show you when I put a search in for this structure, St. Joseph's Seminary in Troy, New York, specifying the location, you can see we have a series of these visuals coming out of predominantly the cardcow.com website that I use a lot to do a search for these structures. But after that, the bottom seems to fall out, and what we get, it jumps us over to St. Joseph's Seminary in Fordham University in New York. I think it's in Yonkers. And the bottom really falls out of the search after that. Here's another nice look at the one in Troy. There it is sitting atop the hill, looking very lonely up here and very imposing. And there is also, connected with this, is the Infants Home, St. Joseph's Infants Home in Troy, New York. This is probably a good example of them taking a lot of the tops off of the upper reaches here while maintaining the lower portion of the structure. But that structure, that part of Fordham, certainly worth a look here as well. Screaming at me, old world. There it is in the modern day, still standing. That was brought to us by the Jesuits. And I just punched this into my Grok AI generator, which is not always fruitful in its results, I have found. You can see my search give me a timeline for the St. Joseph Seminary in Troy, New York. So they started in the 1830s, Archdiocese of New York and Nyack. Lafargeville is the next one. They established that one in Fordham. Here's the one in Troy, 1863. The property is originally built for Troy University on Mount Ida, so that would be overlooking the city. Purchased by St. Mary's Church of Albany. 1864, Archbishop McCloskey establishes the seminary in Troy, repurposing the building that was there. So this building was actually not originally built for that purpose, we're being told. Operating in Troy between 1864 and 1896, training hundreds of priests, of course. This is the construction of the one in Yonkers, we're being told, the one I showed you, 1891, which is to replace the one in Troy. Then they closed their operations in Troy in 1896. After its closure as a seminary, the Troy building is used for various purposes, including briefly housing orphans, of course. The Sisters of St. Joseph purchased the property. Eventually, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute acquires the property in 1958, renaming it a university building. And we're coming to the end of the timeline here. In 1969, with its distinctive Byzantine architecture and four spires, this building is razed, ending its physical presence in the Troy skyline. Is there anyone out there that remembers this structure standing that was in this region before 1969? Another one of those amazing structures, no longer with us, but certainly worthy of being remembered, and much older, I think, than we're being told. And I've got two more structures for you, two hotels actually in the New York area. We begin with the Hotel Majestic, or Majestic Hotel. A beautiful looking structure here, you can see, with 6 independent structures coming off a base. You can also see you have the lower reaches fenced off and the windows going below street level, which we so often see, certainly in this area of the world as well. And this article coming from Dayton in Manhattan. Blogspot, fantastic website for a lot of these old world structures in the New York area and Manhattan area. And we'll just take a look at some of the narrative here, where we get a little backstory on this gentleman and how he amasses his fortune, learning the business, saving his money, retires the millinery business around 1880, and he turns his attention to real estate. 1890 began what would be as a crowning achievement in that field. Starts buying up the vacant plots in that Central Park West area. And by the time he gets 12 of them, he decides he wants to build this hotel. Now this is a 14-story hotel in the early 1890s being constructed. A family hotel, we're being told. Taking 3 years to build. We have a marble-lined lobby, our main hall. We have some looks here at some of the interior. This is the type of interior finish that was going on. That looks like a skylight ceiling of some sort. Probably the gap maybe in between the 6 structures, not sure, because it doesn't stand anymore. All we can do is speculate, but you can see the level of opulence going on here. And of course they're trying to explain that with one of the big names in the inheritor's narrative. Its 12 stories were the equivalent of 14 floors in height, of course. So we have some high ceilings going on here. Of course, requiring elevators, 7 elevators. The finest description: marbles, hardwoods, bronze, brass, and metalwork of all kinds. Remember, only 3 years as well. Formally opened in 1894, that time period very suspect, so much going up at that time. Although you don't really see it in this photograph, all you see is the building featured and one next to it. I will spare you the details of the narrative as we look at the main dining room with the ceilings painted and clearly marble columns with the light fixtures coming off of those. And as we scroll through the narrative, we find that it had a rooftop garden, but we find as we get to 1928, into that timeline, all these plans are being put together for Art Deco apartment buildings, and part of those plans had the Majestic Hotel being demolished. So this thing stands for less than 40 years, and we see its replacement here. So the Hotel Majestic no longer with us, only in memory. And we're still in Manhattan. We come to the Marie Antoinette Hotel. And you can see here again having a lot of the similar features that the Majestic shared with its railing. Very, very deep shades over the windows. And we'll take a closer look here before we move on to some of the narrative. You get a lot of ornate decoration. You have a stone balustrade up top and a spectacular looking mansard style roof up top. It's coming out of that same time period, and I would guess this must have been at least 3 to 5 years, according to the narrative. Let's have a look. So just a bit of storyline. 1893, William L. Flanagan, president-director of Clausen & Son Brewing Company, a brewer, inheritor, decided to diversify and get into the hotel business, it looks like. So he hired this fellow, Munkowski, to design a 7-story residential hotel, northwest corner of Broadway and 66th Street. Faced in limestone, gently rounded, decoration in the midsection, as we saw. We have a price, of course, flat $225,000. This building is completed on October 28th, 1894. Now, here's a real problem with the timeline, and this is certainly worth highlighting. The thought of even building this hotel first appears in 1893. They don't tell us when in 1893. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say January 1893. Less than 2 years later, this thing is complete and ready to be opened. And we get comparisons in the Tribune to the White City of Chicago World's Fair, which would have just occurred right over the same time period. And we're being told that it was a restrained exterior belying the sumptuous French interiors. So the inside even more spectacular than the outside. I would really like to know how long this took to complete from start to finish, and how far down into the ground they went with this. And this Dayton and Manhattan article giving us a couple looks at the interior with its wrought iron doors, you can see here. And just a taste of some of the interior. So how long were they spending on finishing this thing? They don't account for that in the narrative with a lot of these structures. Absolutely impossible feat, as far as I'm concerned, to complete this in that short time span. We have the oak room here, paneled and carved antique oak under an immense stained glass dome. Probably only took them a couple hours to complete that, to allow it to fit the timeline, of course. Real problems with the timeline, that's why I feature what I do here on this channel. Some of them really, really jump out at you, and this Marie Antoinette Hotel is one of those. And just a taste of the height of the rooms here. Again, the ceiling height, extended ceiling height. More of the opulence and even the furniture itself. I think a lot of this, the inheritors just crammed a lot of the stuff into these structures. Absolutely spectacular. And you can see here Mr. Flanagan, 1901, so less than 10 years, he divested his real estate holdings and he gives it to his sister. Now this is very confusing because, as we see, a new hotel was to be built. The Hotel Marie Antoinette. And this is the one that we originally looked at. And all of what we previously looked at, the interiors, were supposed to be this structure here. It gets a little bit confusing. I think what they're trying to do is trying to fit this less spectacular structure into that short timeline. Either way, they fail on giving us an adequate amount of time to construct this building. But even this structure is considered to be the annex to the original Antoinette structure. Has a very short timeline as well. He sells the property, or he hands the ownership to his sister, and this one's completed in 1903. So we have a less than a 2-year window, again, to get this one done. Absolutely ridiculous. Now we're told in 1926, this Joseph E. Goulet takes over ownership of the structure, and after a years-long court battle over the name Marie Antoinette, apparently it was switched over to the Hotel Dauphin, and this very confusing timeline begins to meet its end in 1936 as the original Marie Antoinette gets scaled back, and eventually in 1963 it gets demolished. So again, one of those structures that have a ridiculously short timeline and an absurd narrative, and ultimately meets its demise. Something we're supposed to forget about, no doubt, but it will not be forgotten, and here it is. So I hope you've enjoyed this investigation to just a handful of old world structures here in North America. I appreciate you watching. This has been an old world exploration. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe, hit the thumbs up button, and comment. I believe we are in the process of remembering who we really are and casting off the shackles of illusion. Until next time.